Hi everyone, Peter here from Movement and Performance, and in this video we're going to create an annual plan for a weightlifting athlete. So this is for a weightlifter who aims to compete in competitions and perform at their optimal potential at those competitions. And so the annual plan that we create is probably going to be the most important plan that we actually do for the whole year, because it's basically our roadmap. If we don't have an annual plan, we don't really have a direction that we're going in, and essentially we're just working out as opposed to training for an event or competition. So the first thing to notice with this plan before we get into it is that these weeks here, 1 to 52, is obviously the weeks of the year, starting from January going through to December, and these weeks correspond, so these are the same weeks here, and they correspond to these dates. So this, for example, this first week is the 1st of January 2018, and that's the Monday of the first week of the year, and that's the Monday of the second week of the year. So these are all the Mondays, and these correspond to the week that they're lined up with. In terms of these numbers here with the volume and intensity, we'll get into that later, but for now just understand what these numbers mean. So the first thing we need to do in the entire annual plan is understand when we have competitions and what competitions are most important. So in terms of a weightlifter, we don't want to compete too frequently throughout the year, otherwise our ability to actually do some solid general training is going to be diminished because we won't have enough time. But it always depends on the calendar and the requirements of the particular competitions that you're lifting in. So for this example, this is based on the Australian weightlifting calendar for 2018. So we're going to put in a competition. We're going to first put in the most important competition, which will be national championships, which I've already looked up on the calendar, which is during this week here. So let's color that in. Let's make these blue. And then we also have state championships about 8 weeks before national championships, which is during this week, which I've already looked up. And then we might want to do maybe just a less important competition if we need to qualify for state and national championships, or if we just want to get some more experience, we can put another competition here, which there is a monthly competition. So let's fill these in. Let's put a comment here saying that it's local competition. This one here is going to be state championships, and this one here is going to be national championships. So because this is the real competition that we want to be the most peaked for, we're going to sort of put this one a little bit darker to signify that it's more important. I'm going to make this one a little bit lighter to signify that it's not quite as important as the other ones. So in order of importance, we're going to do this. I'm going to have this local one, followed by the state championships, and then the national championships, assuming we qualify for that. So that's the first thing we need to do. Now we can plan our training to ensure that we are peaked at our best for national championships and peaked quite well for state championships, and we probably don't need to peak too well for this local competition. So moving on to our phases of training, as we know with sort of the general periodization schemes, is that we want to accumulate volume first in our early stages, in that general stages of training that's far away from competition, and then intensify that training when we need to be at our best. So because we have such a whole year and we've only got 3 competitions, we can afford to probably have around maybe 12 weeks of of general training, of accumulating volume. So this phase is going to be volume. And then in that volume phase, we might have 3 blocks of training. Since it's 12 weeks, we're going to have 3 consecutive blocks of volume. Block 3. And then as we start to get closer to competition, we want to start intensifying some of that volume that we've built. So maybe we'll have 2 blocks of 2 4-week blocks of then general strength training. And the point of doing the volume before the general strength training is that when we build these general characteristics and accumulate volume, it then improves our potential when we get to these more specific training blocks. And it's also important to understand that the less advanced the athlete is, the probably less requirement for this accumulation, whereas the more advanced, the less advanced, the more requirement for volume accumulation, whereas the more advanced the athlete, the less requirements they need for this sort of training because they've done lots of training previously. So we might then, from general strength training, move to more maximal strength training, leading into state championships. So it's starting to get more and more specific, and we're probably going to be at a pretty good place by the end of this phase. So this will be maximum strength, and we'll have 2 blocks of that. And then leading into national championships, this is when we really want to be at our peak. So this will be our peaking phase, where everything's most specific, and we're probably going to start to drop our volume down and taper so we're at our best. So we'll have 2 4-week blocks there, with obviously this last block being more of a taper. Block 1, block 2. So after our weightlifting competitions have been completed, we want to take more of an active rest period. So we might have, since this intense training is going to be quite taxing on our body, we want to take a few weeks of maybe active rest or not intense training. So we're going to call this the transitional phase here, and we're going to take 2 weeks of a transitional phase. So from there, we've done our main competitions for the year, assuming we haven't qualified for any world or international competitions. We will then start basically the training process again and allow us to peak for the next year. And obviously the calendar probably wouldn't be released by the time for the following year by the time you're making this annual plan. So it's probably best to not plan anything too specific, because things might change. But generally after an intense training phase, we want to start accumulating volume again. But this time with we might go then through quite a long phase of volume again, but this time we're not going to call it volume, we're going to call it hypertrophy. So essentially it's similar training, but we actually want to focus on building some muscle. And I'll get to that in a sec, why we're going to call it hypertrophy as opposed to volume when I talk about here our weight. So ignoring that for now, let's assume we have, this isn't going to fit evenly into 4 blocks, but into 3 blocks, but we'll try it. Oh, it does. All right, so we'll have 3 blocks of hypertrophy, and then again maybe a transitional phase at the end, because this is probably going to be around the holiday period, at least for us in Australia, and they might need to take some time off for family commitments or holidays or whatever it is. So we're going to leave that as a transitional phase. So as I just mentioned with the hypertrophy, the reason we're calling it a hypertrophy phase and not a volume phase is because we want to actually take that time to build some muscle. And so what we're going to do with our weight is we're going to start to increase our weight and make sure we're meeting our particular weight class at the time that we need. So there are weight cutting strategies that we can use to cut a few kilos if we really need to, but for the most part, most of the weight cutting will be done before the competition. So let's say assume we are a 77 kilo lifter and we want to be at 77 kilos for these competitions here. So by this week we need to be at 77, and we'll fill that in. So it's quite a long time to actually hold our weight. We might actually maybe increase weight a tiny bit here and then drop back down, but let's just assume we're going to stay at 77 kilos, probably easier. And remember, this yearly plan is leading in from the previous yearly plan. So this hypertrophy block is where we're going to actually start increasing our weight. So we're actually going to attempt to build some muscle, because it's going to help when we start doing these general and maximal strength training blocks. So we might start increasing our weight here slowly, 77, maybe 0.3 kilos a week, and start getting some good hypertrophy. And we are going to, that's going to last the entire hypertrophy phase until we get fairly, so at this point here we're going to be at 80.6 kilos roughly, assuming we're following that plan, and we probably want to hold that for the transitional period, because if we're not doing much training and we're gaining weight, we're probably just going to put on more fat when our goal is to actually put on muscle. So as we reach our sort of peak weight around here, 80.6, that's at the start of the year, we can then start cutting down back into where we need to be peaked for. So you could even use the start of this phase as hypertrophy, because we probably don't need that much time to cut back down. If we only need 3 blocks of training, we can probably do it in 3 blocks of training here. But it's going to be probably a better idea to cut weight while we're in a high volume phase, because that's going to spare more muscle, and probably if we do it more in a higher intensity, lower volume phase, we are probably going to lose more muscle than we otherwise would. So let's assume that we're going to cut back down. So from 80.6, we're going to start doing it at exactly the same rate, 80.3, 80, and etc. And we're going to cut down until we get back down to 77 kilos. And then maybe we'll hold that 77 kilos until we reach that first competition. Obviously you can do this differently, but this is a general plan. You might want to stay at 78 kilos around here, and then maybe have some sort of strategy to drop 1 kilo acutely right before the competitions. But anyway, we're going to put that in here, and so that general trend is in place. So we know that during the hypertrophy phase, we want to actively be gaining weight, and during this volume phase, we actively want to be dropping weight, and then we want to be maintaining for the competitions. So onto this peaking index here. This is basically with our training and everything in place, how well are we going to perform? So we're assuming that a 1 will indicate our best form, and a 9 will indicate our worst form. So we can do it block by block, and obviously we want to be at our best for the most important competitions. We cannot be at our best the entire year, otherwise we simply will not actually be at our best, because we'll just be maintaining one level of fitness, which is one level of performance, which is not going to help us build performance. So at this point here, just before our national competition, this is where we want to be at our best, so we can assume that's a 1. And then from there, we sort of work backwards, so probably be at around a 2 here, maybe a 3 here, 4, 5, 6, and then from here we're probably going to be a 7, 8, so we're not really going to be at our peak here. During the transition phase, we're probably going to be a 9 because we're not really training weightlifting much at all. Here, coming out of that peaking, we probably still have some good strength, so we'll probably be at around, I don't know, maybe 7, 8, as the volume accumulates. We're going to induce more fatigue, so that can be roughly our peaking index, so what sort of stage we are expecting to be at during each block of training. And that's just about it for this annual plan. The last thing we're going to put in is our rough guide of volume and intensity. So that, as I mentioned before, we have these columns of volume and intensity which I've made up previously, and it's on basically a scale of 1 to 9 again, or 1 to 10, where 1 is going to indicate obviously less, and then like lesser volume or lesser intensity, and the higher the value, the more intensity of volume. The reason I've done arbitrary numbers like this is because when you try and compare weightlifting volume to other exercises, including accessories, squatting, all that sort of stuff, the lifts simply have different volumes and different effects on the body, the different lifts that we perform. So it's very difficult to compare one exercise to the next in terms of volume and intensity. For example, if we have equated volume for back squats, and then the next block we're doing front squats, those we can probably handle more volume doing front squats than we can back squats, just because the load is going to be a lot less. So that's one example, but basically when we're comparing different lifting, the effects are going to be different on the body. It's very difficult to compare. For example, if we have more accessory lifts, if we don't have those accessory lifts, if we change the accessory lifts, they all have an impact on our total volume. So that's why I've used arbitrary numbers, because it's just easier, and also because the annual plan is never going to be a super specific plan. It's always going to be a general map of where we're going, as opposed to a detailed plan, because things are going to change all the time. If athletes have injuries, or they qualify for different competitions, or certain circumstances in their life happen, this is all going to change. That's why it's very, very general and broad. So anyway, let's put this into a graph so we can put it into the annual plan. And I've already previously made these numbers so that they correspond well with the plan that we just created. But essentially, it's going to line up with the phases of training that we've just created. So let's delete all this sort of stuff. We don't need this. So as you can see in this plan, in this graph here, there's no, they line up with the phases of training that we just created. So as you can see, during the volume phase of training, this graph, you can see the volume accumulates, which is essentially what we want to do. And the intensity is going to be slightly lower, and it's not really going to increase much. But then as we get into the general strength, the max strength and peaking, the intensity slowly rises through until it peaks where we need it to peak, and then drops off probably in that last week so that we are rested for the competition, and the volume gradually goes down. And then after we finish that, the transition phase is not much of anything. And then we start slowly accumulating volume again, with the intensity sort of remaining. And then obviously a transition phase where we don't really have much of intensity or volume, because we're not really doing any weightlifting. So let's label these. So this one's volume, intensity, and this one is blue. So let's make that blue. And this one's orange. And there we have the general annual plan that we're going to follow, like a roadmap, to be at our best where we need to be. So thanks for watching, guys. Hopefully you got something out of this. It's difficult to make an annual plan, an individual annual plan that is sort of holistic for all individual sports, just because the training involved is going to be so different. So in terms of weightlifting, it's all going to be strength-based resistance training, mostly at least, whereas something like sprinting as an individual sport will have a lot more speed work, which we haven't obviously included in this, speed and power training, which we haven't included in this annual plan here. So it's difficult to make it for a general plan for all individual sports, but the same principles can be applied in terms of making sure we're peaking for the competitions that we need to be at our peak for, and then planning and manipulating our volume and intensity and our training phases around those competitions, so we're at our best when it counts, not just training randomly throughout the year and doing what we feel like we need to actually ensure that we're leading up to something and our plan has a structure. So thanks for watching, guys. Hopefully you got something out of it, and let me know in the comments section if you want me to create an annual plan for any other particular sports, and I can cover that. Thanks for watching.